guys have your Bibles, I hope that you do. Why don't you open them up to the book of Ruth. Ruth is in the Old Testament, so kind of the first half of the Old Testament. Give you some time to find that. Maybe you're here and you don't have a Bible, forgot it. One of those hectic mornings. You'd like to look in the Bible. We have some Bibles in the back. If you just kind of wave your hand up there, Mr. Warren can definitely bring you one. We do like for you guys to be able to see it. We'll have the words on the screen for sure, but sometimes it's good to have it just right there in front of you. Hey, so a exciting day for us for many reasons. One, we just get to come to church. We get to sing songs of worship, songs to Jesus, about Jesus, for Jesus, and for us. So that's always a good thing. We get to dive into His Word now for a few minutes and see what the Lord has for us. This evening, afternoon, I guess, we're having our baptism. As Davey told you, we've tried to blast it on Facebook. We tried to blast it through emails, and we hope that you guys do come. It's a dual-purposed event. I mean, we're going to go over to Lake Hall, McClay Gardens, and first part of the day is just kind of hanging out. We're going to have food, fried chicken. Like every good church get-together has to have fried chicken if you're in the South. I'm not from the South, but I can handle that part of the South, right? But we're going to have some, and a lot of you have signed up to bring different things. Hopefully lots of desserts. That's, again, the way I kind of judge a good picnic. More desserts than vegetables, okay? But we're going to do that. It's a great time, again, just to kind of hang out, get to know each other a little bit better. Plenty of areas so the kids can run around and chase each other while the adults kick back and talk and that kind of stuff. So we have that part. We're going to do some worship together. Josh is going to lead us in some worship music. So we're going to kind of all get together and we're going to just sing some songs again as a family. And then we're going to go down into the lake and we're going to baptize. And in case I forget this part, because I don't know if you guys know this, but I sometimes get into my messages and I lose track of what I'm supposed to announce. But after the service, if you're getting baptized, or maybe if you have a child that's downstairs that's going to get baptized, if you can meet me in my office, we're just going to kind of go over just a few little things. If the kids are downstairs, don't worry about bringing them up. Moms and dads, this is just kind of making sure that they know where to be and what to wear and all that kind of good jazz. All right, so we're going to meet right in my office afterwards. And maybe you're here today and you haven't said that you want to get baptized, but that's something you want to do. It's still not too late. Just come after the service, meet us back there. Sometimes there's some fear, like you don't want to be the only person being baptized. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think there's around 10 or 12 so far, thereabouts. Some young, some teenagers, some adults. And so it's a little bit of everything. So you don't have to worry about being the only one, all right? So I would encourage you guys, if you've not done that, you want to do it, come meet me in the office after the service this morning. All right, let's start by praying, and then we're going to just unpack this thing. I'm super excited today. Lord, I thank you so much for this morning. I thank you for just the opportunity to get together. Lord, as we just got done saying it, we just get together and sing worship songs to you. And really what a fitting song to end as we go into the time of teaching, like this idea of it as well. And last week, as we really began this study in Ruth, we saw a lot of tragedy, a lot of suffering, a lot of difficulty. And sometimes it's easy for us to say it is well when everything is good and life seems great, but in the midst of those storms, in the midst of those valleys, it as well is, it's difficult. Lord, I pray that you just be with us this morning. I pray that you just remove, again, all the different distractions around us, that you just help us over the next few moments to be able to focus in on what your word says. Lord, I pray that you help me to lift your word high. Help me to be faithful to what it says, not to just add my own thoughts, beliefs, but to stay true to your word. Jesus, as I ask every single week, I ask that you give me your words that you give me your heart, that you give me your passion for this passage today. May everything that we do and everything that we say bring honor and glory to you. Holy Spirit, work in a mighty way. We just love you and we thank you. Thank you for this amazing love story. It's in Jesus' wonderful, perfect name we pray. Amen. So we do have a lot of new faces this morning. Some of you were out last week and missed our first study in the book of Ruth. And our practice is we go verse by verse through books of the Bible. Sometimes we go through the books quickly. Not very often, but every once in a while it happens. Sometimes it takes us a while. We spent about 2 years in the book of Acts. So we spent about 5 weeks, I believe it was, in the book of Haggai, and now we're in Ruth. And we're going to try to get Ruth done in 4 weeks. Last week, as we began this story, we talked about how Ruth is this real rich and amazing love story. I mean, if you've grown up in church, if you've been in church, I mean, you're probably familiar, at least a little familiar with Ruth. I mean, it's kind of cool because there's a couple things that just before we even begin to read the book, a few things stand out. First, it's one of 2 books in the Bible that's named after a woman. Ruth and then Esther. Ruth itself, though, one of the things that even beyond just being named after a woman, one of the things that makes it unique is this is the only book in the Bible that's named after a non-Jew. And that proved to be a very important component last week, and we'll see it this week, and really it flows through the entire book, because what happens is Ruth, she's this Moabite woman. And really before we even get to Ruth, what starts off is there's this husband and wife, Naomi and Elimelech, who live in Bethlehem, a town that we usually associate with Christmas, with baby Jesus. But before that, we go back. Before David, we go back here to Bethlehem, and it's kind of the promised land. It was a land that was designated for the people, and they're there. But famine strikes. I mean, real, genuine famine. Last week I made mention that Bethlehem means house of bread. And so it's it's kind of a big deal when you think a city that has this name, this title, house of bread, is without bread. I mean, there's no food. I mean, they have found themselves in hard times. And so Elimelech, as kind of the leader of the family, he makes a choice to take his family, his wife and their 2 boys, away from this promised land to a new area, to a new town by the name of Moab. This is significant. And I'm not trying to repeat last week's message, but we have to understand some of this background, some of this framework in order to see the real beauty of this story. Because Moab, I mean, its origin, you go back into Genesis chapter 19, and the area of Moab was birthed out of this incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. Like, that's not a good starting point. Like that's not one of those areas when we look back at our heritage. Some of us are patriotic, right? We're not too far removed from 4th of July, and we wave our flags, and we think of our forefathers, and we think of this great heritage we have. That's not really what Moab had. You go back, and as you study Moses, and he's leading the children of Israel through to the promised land, through the wilderness. At one point they get to Moab, and they're trying to seek passage through Moab, but the Moabites want nothing to do with it, and so they reject their passage. And so there's this growing tension between Moab and Israel. Later on, you read this account in which the Moabite women were known to be sexually immoral, and they were trying to set these traps for the Israelite men. Hey, gets to the point where God judges and strikes down, and 24,000 people were killed. And so when you think of Moab, as you look through the Old Testament, what you see is Moab is one of these traditional enemies of Israel, of the Israelites. And so Elimelech chooses to take his wife and 2 sons to this land of compromise. A land that looks as if there's plenty of food and plenty of water and plenty of shelter and plenty of opportunity. But for Elimelech to get to this, he turns his back on where God had desired them to stay. As you go through chapter 1, there's this continuing spiraling of just tragedy. They get there, and soon after, Elimelech dies. He leaves behind his wife, Naomi, and 2 boys. The 2 sons eventually marry Moabite women. And again, if we understand this, I mean, think through this. All of a sudden, you have Naomi who looks at her predicament, who looks at her circumstance, and she's in a foreign area, foreign country. No husband. Her 2 boys have married Moabite women. Like, this is not how she would have designed her life, but that's her reality. And folks, most of us, we have those times in our lives when we find ourselves in reality, right? Not in a situation that we would have crafted, not in a predicament that we would have drawn up, not something we had hoped for, but the reality is that's where we find ourselves, in a reality of this tangled mess. But the tragedy doesn't stop there, because within 10 years, both of her sons die. And Naomi finds herself with no protector, no provider, in a foreign country, with 2 daughters-in-law, with no children. Word comes back to her, I believe it's in verse 6, where she realizes and hears that the famine in Bethlehem is gone, that God has provided, is beginning to bless the area again. And so Naomi decides she's going to go back home, going to go back to her home in Bethlehem. So she goes, and Orpah and Ruth, the 2 daughter-in-laws, begin to travel with her. And then at some point along this journey, probably very early on, Naomi turns to the girls and she's like, "Girls, just stop. Like don't come with me any further. Go back to your home. Go back to your families. Go back to your parents, to your homeland. I mean, find husbands. I mean, the reality is I'm old. I'm too old to probably get remarried. Definitely too old to have children. Just go. Because if you stay with me, what you're asking for is this perpetual mess of a life of just more than likely living out as a widow, more than likely living destitute and poor, and you don't want that. You're too young. There's too much life ahead of you. Just go back home." So this is a plea, really, where you see this love that Naomi has for these girls, where she's just trying to say, "Listen, you'd be better off without me. Start anew." And there's this real emotion. I mean, you just kind of see these 3 ladies together, and they're crying. It's kind of boo-hoo fest. And Orpah decides maybe she's right. Maybe it is better for me to go back home. And so she leaves. But man, maybe one of the richest statements in the Old Testament, especially of devotion, of love, is when Ruth turns to Naomi. I mean, if you didn't do it last week, underline verse 16 and 17 in the first chapter. Because Ruth goes, "Listen, I'm going with you. And your God will be my God. And your people, my people. Where you die, where you're buried, I want to be buried there too." And then after you get to that statement, this climactic statement, The rest of this journey back to Bethlehem is silent. And I can only imagine as they're traveling there, I mean, Naomi's probably rehashing life, thinking through like what could have been, what should have been, what her reality is. This idea of having to go back home. I mean, Bethlehem's a town. It's a small town. I mean, everybody would have known each other. Like the families would have grown up with each other. I mean, everyone knew each other's business. And so she's probably thinking, man, I'm going back. I'm going to have to answer all these questions. And while she's having these thoughts going through her mind, Ruth's walking alongside her, more than likely thinking, I'm a Moabite. And these people are going to hate me. Like I can't change my heritage. I can't change the way I look. I can't change any of that. How will I fit in here? The whispers, the stares, the disrespect, the taunts, all of that is probably coming my way. What do I do? And then they get to Bethlehem as they enter the city, and there's this kind of this cool picture where like the people see Naomi coming and they begin to run to Naomi, and Naomi's home, and Naomi turns them and says, do not call me Naomi. That word, or her name, Naomi, means pleasant. She says, don't call me that. Call me Mara, which means bitter. And she turns to the people and says, man, when I left here, I had everything I wanted. Everything I could have dreamed of. I had a husband, I had a wife, or kids. I mean, I had everything I wanted. But now I come back empty, barren. I have nothing. And last week we talked about this, guys. As she's saying how bad her life is, how she has nothing left, how she's bitter, when God's taken everything from her, standing right beside her is Ruth. I mean, put yourselves in Ruth's shoes for just a minute. As Naomi's going off about how bad life is, who's the constant reminder? But Ruth. Of everything that she's had, everything that she's lost. And that's where we left last week. Except at the very end, there's this glimmer of hope. Because that last verse, the first chapter of Ruth says, as they return to Bethlehem, it was harvest season. This glimmer of hope. Glimmer of hope that despite this bad circumstance, and last week we talked about there are times in our lives, if we're being honest, if we're being truthful, that God just seems so far away. But could it be in the midst of those times when God feels so far away that he's laying this foundation in which he's going to show you, provide for you the greatest display of his faithfulness? And so then we get to chapter 2. And as we've gone through this, and sometimes as we do teaching, I may read the entire passage and we'll go back. But what I want us to do, I want us to try and feel the emotion, the weight, the tension, the excitement of this passage, of this book that this author just so brilliantly wrote. And so we're going to go to Ruth chapter 2. Start in verse 1. It says this. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. When we ended the first chapter, we're left with two characters, Naomi and Ruth. Chapter 2 opens up with kind of this introduction of this knight in shining armor. But it's kind of this somewhat awkward, because all it does is it announces who he is, and then we kind of leave him for a little bit. there's two things that we can kind of take from this one of which we're going to see unpacked today. The other we'll see more unpacked than the following 2 weeks. But in there we see this, in his introduction, two things. We see that that Boaz was a relative. One of the key themes of this book is this idea, this kinsman redeemer. Again, we're going to unpack this the next 2 weeks, or the two following weeks. And this becomes a very significant thing. But beyond that, after that, it says that he was a worthy man. He's worthy. There's two ways in which we can view this idea of worthy. That same word used there to describe him being worthy is the same word used to describe Gideon when it called him a mighty man of valor. And so there's this idea that he was this strong individual. Boaz, his name actually means strength. And if you go and you read about the construction of the temple, on Solomon's porch, one of the pillars is called the Pillar of Boaz. So there's this idea that he was this strong man. But beyond that, he's also this idea of worthy in his character. He was a good man. And a wealthy man, which we'll absolutely see those two things played out here. Okay, so we get there, and then we park Boaz. So we announce Boaz, but he stays here. And then let's go back to our two previous characters. Verse 2, it says, and Ruth the Moabite. Again, notice, and we see this all throughout this book. It's not just Ruth. So often as she's mentioned, as she's talked about, it's always Ruth the Moabite. There's this constant emphasis of her background, of her heritage, of who she was, how she was this outcast, this stranger, this foreigner in their land. And so it says, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. And she, Naomi, said to her, go, my daughter. So again, just a little background for us to understand what's taking place here. If you go back into Leviticus, God created this plan to care for the poor and the destitute. And some kind of call it like the first welfare system. Just like anything, if we go to the Bible and we read, this is the right welfare system. And what was told, the command, the law back then was that as the farmers went to go field and harvest their land, they were to leave the corners of the field. They were to leave that area for the poor, the destitute, the widows, the orphans. That area was for them. And then and beyond just that, as they went and they harvested, if they were to drop stuff and things were to fall off, they were just to leave it there. So leave these, for lack of a better word, leave these scraps for the poor and the destitute. Those poor and those destitute then would have the opportunity to go and work in those corners of the field. That they could go and work in the fields and collect this stuff and take it back home. So there was at least something for them. And so Ruth goes to her mother-in-law and she says, listen, if it's okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to go out here in Bethlehem. I'm going to search for an area that they'll allow me to go and find stuff, find barley in the corners of the field and stuff that was dropped, to glean the fields. I want to go see if I can find someone who will allow me. Now, there's so many implications here. And that's why I think that she doesn't just say, I'm just going to go look and find the scraps. She goes, I'm going to go find someone who will allow me. Because again, the author points it out. She's a Moabite. Remember all the heritage of the Moabites? Remember the tension between Israel and Moab? Remember all of that stuff. I can't speak from experience. I didn't grow up in a time of segregation like our country experienced. Some of you can remember those days. Remember the days when you had like separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, and some were allowed in certain places and other places they weren't allowed. That is foreign to me. My understanding of that is through history books. But it's somewhat similar to what's going on here. Like, there's this great disdain. And so Ruth goes out and she begins to look for this area. Verse 3 says, so she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. This is so awesome. Because do me this favor. Take your pen and see this. And it says, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now understand this, as we go through this portion, Ruth is not from Bethlehem. Ruth doesn't know all the people. She doesn't know all the names. She doesn't know any of that. She doesn't know who's part of Elimelech's family. And when we think through this dynamic here of this time period, you had individuals, then you had families, then you had clans, and then you had tribes. She wouldn't have been familiar with all of that. She's just trying to find an area. And so in the midst of this, it says she just happened to come. We would maybe say it today, like, as luck would have it. Now understand this. The author is setting the stage, is beginning to build this idea, this tension, but this excitement. But I want you to realize and understand that there is no accident in God's economy. There is no accident. God is in complete control. God was the one who set the system in place. God was the one who designed it so that during the harvest season, the ends of the fields, the corners of the fields was available for those who were poor, those who were destitute. And God was the one who orchestrated Ruth and Naomi coming back, returning to Bethlehem in the harvest season. As God is in control, but the author, he's helping us to see that in the midst of our life. We don't always see God. I mean, guys, understand this. Like Ruth is a normal woman. Ruth didn't have the parting of the Red Sea experience. I mean, Ruth didn't have an encounter with a burning bush. There's no direct voice of God coming to Ruth. There's no visions. Ruth is just normal like us. And she just goes and she just happens. She just happens to end up on Boaz's land. And Boaz just happens to be the clan of Elimelech. This is amazing. This is awesome. Verse 4 says, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. So it just so happens that Boaz shows up. And notice like the first words, the first thing that we see Boaz say, the Lord, Yahweh, be with you. I mean, he's going. The boss is going to his workers. He's like, guys, the one and only God, may he be with you. He didn't just treat his workers like slaves or hired hands. And notice that response, man, may he bless you too. And then it says, verse 5 says, then Moses said to the young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? He's like, whoa, who's this? Who is she? But notice it doesn't just say who is she. I mean, who is that? he goes, whose young woman is that? I mean, to what clan does she belong to? Where did she come from? Whose family is she a part of? And so the workers go on, and verse 6, it says, and the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman, again, stressing Moabite woman, who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from the early morning until now, except for a short rest. So Boaz, attention is caught by Ruth, and he does this little background check on her. Who is she? What's her story? What's going on here? And they just say, listen, she came, she asked for permission, and she's been working. I mean, she's been working hard. She's only taken a little short rest. I mean, this is a hard-working woman. And then we have our first interaction between Boaz and Ruth. Notice this, verse 8, it says, then Boaz said to Ruth, and guys, he says some like profound stuff right here. Just feel this and see this and put yourself into both Boaz's shoes as well as into Ruth's shoes. And verse 8 says, and then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one. But keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping. Go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink that the young men have drawn. Okay, so we read that like, okay, what's the big deal? No, listen. I mean, he says to her, first off, he's like, this, and this is not just like, hey, you're good looking. I'm trying to make a move on you. At this point, I don't know that there's any of that magic going on. And the term that he uses to her is daughter. This is more of this looking out a sense of compassion, of mercy. And he says, listen, there's no need for you to leave this field. Don't go searching for other lands in which to go glean off of. Just, you're safe here. I mean, in fact, he says there, keep close in the middle of that verse, towards the end of verse 7 or 8. He says, keep close. Maybe you circle that. That keep close, that's the same word that we talked about last week when it said that Ruth clung to Naomi. It's the same word that's used in Genesis 2:24 when it talks about this marriage, when the husband is to leave his family and to cling to his wife. It's the same, it's the same word used here. And so he's saying, listen, just don't leave, stay here. I'm going to protect you. I've already told the guys to make sure nothing happens to you. And again, we go back into this time period to understand, like she's this foreigner. People could be looking to take advantage of her. She's a widow. She's got nobody to protect her. And yet Boaz just says, listen, don't go anywhere. Stay here. I'm going to provide this food for you. I'm going to protect you. And maybe we don't get this at first, but then he says, listen, and if you're thirsty, listen, go over to those jars, those young guys filled up, and just drink from there. Hey, listen, that sounds chivalrous to us today, right? That sounds good. This is a time when foreigners filled the water vessels for the Israelites. This is a time period when the women filled these vessels for the men. This was not a time in which the Israelite men would fill vessels for a foreign Moabite woman. But yet that is what Boaz says to her. He is reaching out. He is providing. He is protecting. He's caring for the outcast, the poor, the widow. And then notice her response. Ruth's response in verse 10 says, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, which is that same idea, the same word used for worship, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? And this is the question that wraps all around the second chapter of Ruth. Why? Why? What did I do to deserve this? Notice this about Ruth. Because at the beginning I try to craft this as we looked back at the first chapter that reality can stink sometimes. Like life is not always easy. There's challenges. There's hardships. And Ruth doesn't respond with, it's about time. It's about time you came through for me, God. It's about time. But her response was, why? Why have I found favor in you? I mean, again, look at this, guys. Ruth has been in the fields all morning long. She's poor, she's destitute. She's been working hard. It's in their harvest season, so it's hot outside. She's sweaty. Her hair's a mess. There's no makeup. Ruth's focus was not on the way she looked. Boys and girls, young people, I think that's a little side lesson for us. Like society today is cramming down your throat this idea of the way that we should look. And we focus in on the outward appearance. But here in Ruth, there's no focus on her outward appearance. We see the heart of Ruth. When she says, why? I don't deserve this. Why am I finding favor in you? And this sets up this beautiful conversation that we're about to see. Verse 11 says, but Boaz answered her, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. So we see Boaz, as he's learned about Ruth, this mercy and this grace, this love. Well, Boaz basically says to her, listen, I respect what you've done. So here's the protection, here's the provision, here's the water. Let me encourage you to keep going. Don't stop, keep going. And then verse 12, check this out. Verse 12, Boaz prays for Ruth. Okay, look at, and underline, this is awesome. One of my favorite parts of this particular second chapter says, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. And underline this, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. What beautiful imagery. Boaz is praying for Ruth, and he's like, man, may God fully repay everything that you've done and more. May he give you your food. May he give you your shelter. May he give you your family. May he give you all these things, and may you find it under his wings. Man, that's awesome. Let's keep going. And then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. So even though I'm foreign, even though I'm a Moabite, I have found favor in your eyes, and thank you. And then there's this pause. And so we have this, you guys feel this, like this tension, this story where, we're building up, and then there's this pause. The end of verse 13. And it goes into verse 14, and it says, and at mealtime. So you have all this, and after they're done, apparently after this conversation, Ruth goes back to work. She goes back into the field. She's gleaning. She's working. She's finding what she can, what the barley and all that. And then lunchtime arrives. Verse 14 says, and at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her the roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So Boaz goes out to her. He finds her and says, come on, it's lunchtime, come. Come eat with us. The roasted grain, the bread. I know we live in a day and age when they say bread is bad for you. Do we have any fans of Carrabba's here? Come on now. The rest of you are lying. Is there anything better than when they bring that hot bread out there and then they take that little saucer with whatever it is in the herbs and whatever else, and they put the oil in there? Right? Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? You take that bread, you slop it around in there, and you eat it. At our house, when we go out to Carrabba's, when they bring the first basket, we say, you may as well bring another one, right? And we just keep them coming. And that's what's going on here. She's coming there. She's sitting there. She's eating. But notice that. I want you guys to see this, because this is again one of those little things that when we just read it doesn't necessarily jump off the page to us, but it's important because it says after he says, come here and eat and dip the morsel in the wine, it says, so she sat beside the reapers, and he is Boaz. It says, he passed to her roasted grain. Boaz is serving Ruth. One of the things that's significant about that, it says he passed. That word is only used one time in the Old Testament. Right here. The boss of the land, the head over all the servants, for lack of better words, the Lord of the harvest, is serving the Moabite woman. And this is a lady who's no doubt been working all day long. Food is scarce. She is hungry. She's probably packing down the bread just like we would at Carrabba's. She reaches her fill, and there's still some left over. She asks for her goodie bag. She asks for her to-go box, packs it up, and goes back to work. As she leaves there, verse 15 says, when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also put some from the bundles for her, and pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. So Boaz goes to his guys, and he says, listen, let her take whatever she wants. In fact, don't draw attention to it. Don't embarrass her. But as you're going, as you're working, occasionally drop some of this barley for her to grab and to take. Guys, we begin to see this picture of not just grace, but abundant grace, abundant blessings. This story is just so amazing. Verse 17 says, and so she gleaned in the field until evening. And she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay, so she's been working in the fields all day long. collecting this stuff. And not only did she have to collect it, again, I'm a city boy. I've not worked one day on a farm my entire life. I don't know what any of this means. So as I'm reading and understanding, I mean, she takes this barley, this stuff that she's collected, she's beaten out. There's a whole other process there. Finally, she gets to the good stuff, the stuff that she can use. It says that she has collected, after beating it all out, she collected 1 ephah. Most of us are like, oh, well, what is that? Okay, so one of the commentaries I read said that it was somewhere between like maybe 1/2 and 2/3 of a bushel. Still not much help. Okay? And so here's what it is. When she gets done with all of that, it's somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds. Hey guys, to help give us some perspective in this, an ancient Babylonian male worker, his average day ration was somewhere between 1 and 2 pounds. And Ruth, in one day, gets somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds. Enough for her and Naomi to last at least 2 weeks in one day. It just keeps getting better. And verse 18 says, and she took it up and she went into the city. So Ruth is a tough lady. She's worked all day. She's beaten the barley stuff to get whatever she needs to get to where she got somewhere between 30 and 50 pounds. And then she puts it in a sack and she carries it all the way home. Verse 19 says, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So you remember Mara? You remember Naomi, like bitterness? Well, she's starting to soften. There's this giddiness now of Naomi where she sees Ruth coming and she sees this big sack with all this barley. And she's like, where in the world did you go? I mean, who did you find that much favor in that they allowed you to leave with that much? And could you probably even imagine her face when all of a sudden after Ruth throws that down and then she digs out the leftovers from lunch? And the story begins, well, not only did I just get the food, I mean, he brought me to the table, he fed me, they've offered me this water, he told me like I don't have to leave, I can just stay here. Again, as we're thinking through this story, guys, like understand, Ruth knows where she was at. Ruth knew that she was in the fields of Boaz. She knew the kindness and the grace and the mercy and the love that Boaz had extended her as an outcast, as a foreigner. But she had no idea of this relation that he had to their family. Naomi, she knows who Boaz is. She knows the relation, the connection, but she had no idea where Ruth was all day. So she said to her mother-in-law, with whom she had worked, and said, and again, like feel this tension, feel how like the author is building this up. The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Like she probably recites the whole thing and everything that happened that day. And she leaves like the most important detail to the very end. It was Boaz. And then Naomi begins to go from being giddy to overly excited. The wheels begin to turn. Verse 20 says, and Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, The man is a close relative of ours. This one of our redeemers. Again, connecting to that first verse. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close and cling to my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And now he said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests. And again, as we picture this, as we think through this dramatic story, Ruth goes out and she continues to work in this field till the time of harvest. 2-3 months pass. And then chapter 2 ends like so anticlimactic. Because it says, the last statement it says, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And that's how it ends. Chapter 2. As you think through that, you're part of your, at least as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, I'm like, man, Boaz, where are you? What did you do? You've already had your first date. What? You don't have to wait 3 months to call her back. What in the world is going on? But again, this takes us to what we've been talking about last week and again this week, that in the midst of the sorrow, in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of all the questions, and as we looked at that first chapter, we saw this need, that there's two main things, there's two great needs that Naomi and Ruth have. One is food, and the second is family. And in this chapter, we see that not only was she provided with the food, she wasn't just given scraps. It was this abundant blessing. And again, it reminds us those times when God seems so far away. When the questions mount, the struggle gets more and more difficult. And we're in the midst of tragedy and we're looking for triumph. We begin to question God and we think he's just absent or he's not there. Folks, it might just be in the midst of that, in the midst of the sorrow and the struggle, that God is building this foundation of his greatest display of satisfaction for us. What do we do with this chapter? My time is gone. I was long-winded last week. I'm long-winded this week. How do we unwrap that? What do we do with this part of the story? Listen, I think there's two things that we can see quickly. Real quickly. When we talk about this idea of love, when we look at the two kind of main characters that we saw today, Ruth and Boaz, we see the way in which we should love, or how we should love, through the character of Boaz. And then we see how we should receive love through the character of Ruth. First, listen, while this story grows and while it continues to develop, while the author begins to continues to paint this picture, we see that there does become this attraction, there becomes this genuine love between Boaz and Ruth. But it doesn't start there. It starts with this man who just was gracious, who was loving, who sought out an outcast, who had mercy, but not just mercy, abundant blessing. Folks, we as individuals and we as a faith family should live the same way. But we should spend our lives looking, pursuing, and seeking ways in which we can help the outcast, that we should help the poor, that we should help the needy. And then Ruth, as she receives this, to me, I wrote a couple of things down here. Remember that verse 12, the second chapter, when Boaz is praying for Ruth. Before I get to Ruth, let me back this up too, because this is an important thing. Boaz prays for Ruth, right? That she finds shelter, that she finds all those things, that she finds this protection under God's wings. You know the things I've learned with prayer? Prayer tends to do one of two things, if not both. One, it may change the hand of God. But then two, prayer oftentimes changes the heart of the one praying. You know what I think? One of the things I think that the church, universal church, is extremely guilty of is prayer with no action. Like we pray, like we'll pray for all these people in Africa that they may come to know Jesus. We ask and we pray for those who are starving and in need, but we don't do anything about it. What does Boaz do? Boaz prays, doesn't he? He's praying for her. But then Boaz goes and he says, all right, I'm going to give you provisions. I'm going to provide protection. I'm going to give you food. I'm going to give you water. And I think we ought to pray that way. I think we need to pray with action. Ruth, though, again quickly. Ruth found rest under his protection. I want to end with this thought. Taking the words of Boaz. Boaz says to Ruth when they first meet, don't leave these fields. There's more than enough for you. There's enough to satisfy you. There's protection here. There's all that. We've said this time and time again. Don't chase what appears to be maybe greener pastures over there. I mean, almost, and it could be saying, don't be like Elimelech, who left this and pursued what looked like a greater opportunity. Stay here. Folks, for those of us who are young, those of us who are old, we beg and plead with you to stay in God's fields. Don't wander off and chase the field of materialism. Don't chase the field of pornography. Don't chase the field of addiction. Don't chase those fields. Listen, God's fields are the only fields that will satisfy, completely satisfy. Those other fields, they're dangerous. And they're empty. And they'll bring sorrow, tragedy, brokenness. May we stay in God's fields. May we rest under his wings. Let's pray.
song.